This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
On today's World Insight, renewable energy solutions for a warming planet. Could major powers buckle down to climate action to head off catastrophe? Could innovation and collaboration prevail over tensions? Borge Brende, the World Economic Forum president, tells us his take on the bigger picture in a one-on-one.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. As global warming takes its toll on the planet, human survival, our very own fate, depends on a rapid shift to clean and renewable energy. But that great transition asks for important support from tech innovation, efficient global supply chains, and serious international cooperation. Yet all these are facing tremendous challenges as our world changes. So here's my latest interview with Borge Brende, president of the World Economic Forum, who visited China recently as the world leaders gather for the G20 summit and COP28 later this year. So what does it take to bring the world together again? Here's my interview with him.
Beijing this time greeted me so well with blue skies for several days. And it's incredible to see how fast China has transformed when it comes to also, for example, renewable energy. In a few years, China has become the superpower of the renewables. And today, renewables is more than 40% of the electricity production of China. That's more than what is produced by coal. So that's a very uplifting news.
So China already have become the largest producer of renewable energy and also the user of it. What does that mean for the rest of the world?
So President Xi Jinping's vision that has been laid out is that China should peak when it comes to CO2 emissions by no later than 2030 and net zero by 2060. But what is really happening now is that you see that green energy, renewables is growing so fast, both solar but also wind. And as you said, China is not only manufacturing windmills and solar panels, it's also the fastest one walking the talk. So there is so much renewable energy coming in. Of course, also over time, the phasing out of coal is important, but one also has to understand that you have to balance in the electricity system so you don't have blackouts. You know that solar and wind cannot today be stored in huge batteries because it's too expensive. So you have to balance this either with hydropower, nuclear, or with coal. So hopefully there will be breakthroughs also on the battery side in the years to come. So the renewable proportion can go from 40 to maybe 70, 80%.
Earlier this week, the great news is that the hydropower park in China has been established in Xinjiang. Having said that, though, what is the picture in terms of timetable are you looking at globally, particularly after participating in the CITE meeting?
So there is a big growth in renewable energy globally. It's not going as fast as we would like because our planet is on fire. And if there is a fire, you have to also move fast to deal with it. But one of the things that are also on the positive side is that the price for renewables have fallen so dramatic. 10 years ago, the price of solar was 10 times what it is today. 10 years ago, the price of wind was 7 times. And then you had to subsidize it. Today, solar is probably the cheapest way of producing electricity in many parts of the world. So it competes much better than, for example, coal, even natural gas, LNG. So this is incredible positive news. But of course, the solar works best when there is sun, and the wind works best when there is wind. So we also have to balance this, so that we have to have other energy sources too. That's why I think doubling down on green hydrogen and also other energy sources, like, for example, fusion when it comes to nuclear, but also fourth-generation nuclear plants that China is also planning is of big interest, because there is no danger of a meltdown because it's in a black box. So if there's no electricity, you will not see the kind of meltdown as you saw in Fukushima that caused this terrible, terrible catastrophe.
Meanwhile, there's the issue of raw materials. As we know, many of these renewable energies will be produced with components that are made of special materials.
It is true that some of the rare materials, including rare earth, but also lithium, that is very important in battery production. There is not enough of these minerals currently at our disposal. But there are resources out there, so I just think we have to really move faster in developing this, because I hope that that will not be the thing that stops the development of the new renewables, because we need energy for development. You know, there's 800 million people on this planet that don't even have access to electricity. We can't say to them, oh, you cannot have electricity and put on the lights so your children can read at night. That's not an option. We also have to make sure that we eradicate poverty with energy, but we have to decouple that from growth in CO2. And then there is no other way than rolling out the renewables and to roll out solar panels, wind, and etc. We also need battery capacities, storing capacities, and then we need those minerals. So we have to really, really share this, and we have to collaborate. We have to just think win-win and not zero-sum game.
At this point, of course, it's difficult because of the leftovers of the pandemic and also geopolitics, just to name a few. So from your perspective, how to constructively get things done?
So the big paradox these days is that because of the global fragmentation, and there is so much competition between countries, and also polarization, is that even on those things we really, really need to collaborate, there is a lack of collaboration. Because those problems that really are the toughest ones we are faced with travel across borders without a passport. A possible new pandemic doesn't travel with a passport. CO2 emission and greenhouse gases don't travel with a passport. That shows that we're all in it together. But we're not acting accordingly. We are more now looking at how we can decouple, how we can then also find negative sides with each other. And that is not going to bring prosperity. Also on the trade side, there's so much we can do together. And we have seen for decades, after decades, that when we trade with each other, it also creates prosperity. Of course, you can adjust a bit and say you want to secure your supply chains and all this. But let's not lose the baby with the bathwater, because then we're losing also growth, prosperity, and collaboration.
Do you think we can be as stupid as forgetting about the benefits that trade has brought to us?
I don't think we can totally exclude it. But let's now use common sense. But sometimes I have the feeling that common sense is not that common anymore.
It's an interesting comment you just made. Having said that, talking about trade, we see the interaction between China and the United States over the past few months. We have seen 3 ministers level visit together with some special envoy level as well. So how do you see, including the latest one from Commerce Secretary Raimondo in China, how do you see these kind of interactions could send signals to the rest of the world about our economy, about the potential that we can still live in peace?
I think things look a bit better now between the G2, China and the US being more than 40% of the global economy. A lot is at stake. And the visits from Secretary Blinken, also from Secretary Yellen, and also Secretary Kerry, and now with Secretary also Raimondo here, we are at least seeing that China and US is talking together. I don't think they agree on everything, that's for sure. But this notion of total decoupling that someone raised a few years ago, I think is no left.
It's not the choice.
No, it's not the choice. Of course, there are other notions like de-risking and friend-shoring and etc. But the World Economic Forum has also looked at the cost of decoupling. If we were to decouple, it would cost us 8% maybe of the global GDP. That is worse than the worst depression ever. That would lead to a lot of poverty and also a lot of people would lose their livelihood. But today, I think we're seeing more an adjustment of this. And I think it's good that the US and China is talking together. What we probably would see, though, is that most of the trade, US-China trading $700 billion together annually, will continue. But there will be some areas on very advanced semiconductors, technology, but also products of dual use, civil and defense, that maybe will not be traded. But as long as 90–95% of the trade can continue, that's not that bad. But for China, this is a challenging moment in the sense that we also see that the consumption patterns are changing in many of the important export countries. Because just during the pandemic, we bought TVs, we bought furnitures, everything that was like commodities. But now, after the pandemic, people want to travel, they want to go to the theater, there's an increase in the services. And of course, services as an export and import is also growing, but China is a manufacturing hub of the world. So in addition to some of the kind of so-called risk handling, de-risking means that some of it goes to Mexico, Vietnam, and India. But I'm happy to also share that medium, long term, I'm very bullish, optimistic on behalf of the Chinese economy.
How do you see this apparently global trend of people looking more inward rather than outward? At least that's what some analysts believe. What does that mean for trade and for our interactions, the nature of our interactions in the future?
So global trade has been also a guarantee for substantial global growth. And you know, we are now in the lowest growth we have seen in a long time. The global growth 3% this year. And if we continue on a strategy of partly decoupling or de-risking, we don't trade with each other, we don't use the comparative advantages in the economy, then we can go into a decade of slow growth. We can repeat the 1970s, and everyone will lose from that. Not only a few nations, everyone will be poorer. So we have to now take the necessary measures to rebuild trust in the World Trade Organization, rebuild trust in trading with each other, and see that this zero-sum game thinking, that really is an impasse. We have to break this impasse now to create also growth. Of course, we have to also go through some structural changes to make this happen, but let's avoid slow growth.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference. Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Meanwhile, we are also seeing the trend that everybody is trying to build the same thing that everybody else is doing, meaning there will be repetition in global supply chains. How would you compare what we experience in history to what is going on right now? Do we all together have to hit a very hard wall before we stop this?
I hope not. And I think there are some silver linings too. I think the breakthroughs on the technology side, not only on artificial intelligence, but also in the Internet of Things, the way we share data, but also when it comes to, for example, the new ways we deal with medicine, synthetic biology, will create so many changes and innovations. Of course, it will kill some jobs, but I think overall it will create more jobs and more interesting jobs. Jobs higher up in the value chain that will pay better salaries. And I think these new technologies will bring us really into the fourth industrial revolution or even the fifth industrial revolution. And that will also increase productivity. And with increased productivity, it's also increased prosperity. And this, I think, is very important for China too. And I said, medium, long term, I'm very optimistic on the Chinese economy. And why is that? One is that 11 million students leave universities in China every year. That's a huge, huge force for change and innovation. And we also know that China is leading in many of these new technologies that will be so important for increasing productivity in the future. For those that are like hanging in there and say, oh, we don't want change, of course, we have seen in history that those nations are not doing well. It's those nations that are open for change and embracing the new technologies. Also, of course, the big investments in infrastructure in China that maybe some people say have over-invested, that may be the case, but overall, of course, for a country like China to have world-class infrastructure, speed trains, roads, airports over time, this will be very, very important. And I also see now that China is diversifying, as you also mentioned, its manufacturing. Also then inviting to more domestic than consumption, but also moving more into also services and services export.
High quality growth, as they say.
Yeah, high quality growth, definitely. And we also see that China is now making many bilateral trade agreements and regional trade agreements. So I think US is around 15–16% of China's export. So there is then 84% of the export goes to other countries. So China will also diversify and find its way. And I think this is now something that is looked at, and there will be structural changes. Structural changes are not necessarily very comfortable, but the alternative is worse, because the only way to grow and revive growth is that you invest in the new technologies, in research and development, in students, and quality of life.
Let me ask you about development. We have seen increasingly the names of Global North and Global South are being emphasized today, particularly after the pandemic. Earlier, I was at the BRICS Summit, and I have learned something quite interesting from those emerging economies and developing countries. that it is not just infrastructure, but also industrialization that these countries want. Of course, they don't want to go back to the old type industrialization, meaning using tremendous amount of resources, not environmentally friendly, but rather they want to have the different levels of industrialization taking place at the same time because they're developing countries. So how do you see the World Economic Forum, together with your partners around the world, be able to provide more impetus, ideas, synergy, and support to the development issues?
No, very important. And there is a fact still that the emerging economies are growing much faster than the industrialized economies, even in this situation that we are today. But it's the leapfrogging that is now important. And for us, it's also very important to underline the importance of digitalization and having digital access. If you have digital access, you can be part of the fourth industrial revolution. If you are in a situation where most of you people don't even have access to affordable internet, you lose...
Or even electricity.
Yeah, and you lose an edge. And there is 3.6 billion people that don't have digital access. And this gap has to be closed very fast. That's why the World Economic Forum has launched with our business partners and different governments this initiative where we want to connect a billion people, the Edison Initiative. And we already, by this initiative, have been part of connecting 400 million people where we work with the private sector. And there are very cost-effective ways of doing this. You can reach millions of people with very low cost. And even if they then get a cell and get connected, if there are many enough, you can drive down the prices if there's competition between the mobile operators and later on also on the internet. We also believe in trade and fair trade when it comes to the global south. That's why the World Economic Forum now works so closely. We have an MOU with the African Free Trade area, Continental Free Trade area. It's 1.5 billion people. It's the youngest continent on the earth, and it's fast growing. And you know, it's very little intra-African trade. They trade with the outside, but not so much with each other. China being their biggest trade partner with more than 250 billion US dollars a year in trade. And the only way for these nations to really grow is that they also have things that they produce at home that they can sell abroad. And that manufacturing and also digitalization is at core of that. And we know that also President Xi Jinping will be hosting a very important summit, Belt and Road, here in Beijing in October. And I know the development is at core of that summit.
We have seen the Belt and Road being updated. Earlier, it's mainly infrastructure.
Yeah.
And building infrastructure in the developing world together with our partners. But now, it's much more than that. It's about green BRI. But at this moment, funding is important. So is the know-how to implement, talents as well. So the list of challenges continues. How do you see that we still maintain this aspiration?
I think it's very important that China is the second largest economy of the world, 20% of global GDP, also take a responsibility for development in other countries. That's what at the core of BRI, that one can also learn from the way China has eradicated poverty. Never in the history of humankind have a country lifted so many people out of poverty in such a short time as China has done. Of course, it's not possible to replicate totally this history, but I think China is showing also increased interest of being a partner with many other countries that are less fortunate than China. And I think China has muscles to do so. There's a lot of focus now on the debt in China is so high, but you know, most of this debt is domestic debt. Very little is external debt. I think we have a tendency of forgetting that.
We are seeing in the rest of the year G20 coming up. You were earlier at the B20 engaging with the business community. And also later, the Belt and Road Initiative, the forum, and at the same time, the upcoming APEC, in which leaders of the APEC economies are all likely to gather, including likely China and the United States. Meanwhile, there's also going to be the climate change COP coming up. So one after another, important international events. How do you see these events could help us to clarify some of the thoughts that we should have, and also some of the important ideas?
I think each of them, in their own way, are very important meetings. The first one will be the G20 meeting hosted in New Delhi by Prime Minister Modi. I know that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping had very constructive discussions also during the BRICS summit, where they agreed on the Chinese idea of letting new countries into BRICS. So
BRIC Plus.
Yeah, so BRIC Plus, and I think this is also good news when it comes to the relationship between India and China, that I think is very critical, because there is positive for the world that these two big emerging economies, very populous countries, 3 billion, almost half of the global population lives in these two countries, that works out well. And I think the G20 meeting in Delhi will be important. I also think Belt and Road will be incredibly important. And APEC meeting, even more so, because we do hope that President Xi Jinping and President Biden can have a really good sit down there. Maybe even there could be a more formal visit from the Chinese president to the US, because everyone wants now stability, predictability. We're paying a high price for the wars and the conflicts, and also the lack of trust. And we have to build trust also in the run-up to COP28. That is an important climate meeting in the UAE, where we hope that the stock taking that is happening there shows that countries are now complying with their commitments that they took on in Paris and in Glasgow. I think there will be also big ambitions coming out there in UAE from COP28 when it comes to ambitions on scaling renewables. Maybe we can triple the amount of renewables in the coming decades. I think also we now have to deliver Copenhagen in the UAE. We're still probably lacking 15 billion annually, what was promised for facilitating investments in renewables and energy transformation in developing countries. In Copenhagen, 15 years later, we haven't delivered it. So that needs to be delivered. And maybe even more important is the big opportunity in January, where we come together in Davos, in the snow, beginning of the year. Hopefully we can then see 2024 even as a more optimistic year, and under the umbrella of rebuilding global trust. I think that's a huge opportunity. We also hope for senior Chinese participation. We have good indications, and also after a very successful summer Davos in Tianjin.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Great to be back on your channel.
That's my interview with Borge Brende, President of the World Economic Forum. With that, we're coming to the end of today's program. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.